Hey, everybody. Jason Hubbard, COO of Rev Genius, back with you. Hopefully, most of you have been with us for most of the day today because we have had incredible sessions so far. And I'm really excited to be bringing on Justin Simon right now. So Justin Simon is founder of Justin Simon Consulting, but better known for the Distribution First podcast that he hosts. And as a lifelong marketer, demand gen, growth person, whatever flavor you want to put on that, he speaks directly to my heart as far as if you're creating content and you're not getting it out in front of people, and if you're not reusing it as many ways as you possibly can, then you're not doing content right. So, Justin, this is going to be a great session. Excited to have you on with us.
Awesome to be here, Jason. Super, super excited.
Awesome. All right, over to you.
Sounds great. Hey everybody. So originally they asked me to do a content distribution masterclass, which is actually turning into a rapid fire session here. So hopefully the plan is to cruise through some some high level topics around distribution, show you some examples about how I use distribution every single week for my content. Stick around. I'm going to give you a free resource where you can look through the ins and outs of how I actually execute on this. And we're gonna have a ton of Q&A at the end, so hopefully I can get through everything, and we'll be able to answer some questions at the end here. So real quick from my end, I promise I will not take too much time. My name is Justin. I help B2B SaaS marketers distribute their content and get more out of everything they create. I love helping other content marketers, content teams be able to get more out of the stuff they're creating. If that's ever something you're interested in, hit me up at justinsimon.co or come hang out on LinkedIn. I chat about this stuff all day, every day. So I don't know if any of you have seen this stat. It's one I have essentially become obsessed with over the last few years. And it's really one that completely changed my mindset around content marketing. And it's this idea that 90% plus of the content that you create gets no traffic from Google. So for me, when I first read this article in 2020, my entire content strategy was built on SEO. When I was working at a company called TechSmith, we were having massive success with SEO, driving honestly millions of views a year on SEO content. And while this article kind of talks about how to be in the other 9.3%, I couldn't get over this idea that 90% of the content that we were creating was never going to get picked up by Google. So that really kind of made me take a step back, and I was like, oh, yikes. So I'm having my team create all this content. We're doing all this work, spending hours and hours in meetings and what should we create? And hardly any of that is going to show up in Google. How are people going to actually consume this content? That's when I realized we've got a problem. We're creating way too much content without a plan to get that in front of people. And that has been the whole framework and idea and mindset shift that I've had to do over the last few years, which is what is the point of creating all this content as a wonderful content marketers and marketers if nobody actually sees it? And I challenge you at the end of this, maybe go into your analytics, maybe do a little bit of a deep dive, and you might start to see what I see typically when I get into other people's dashboards, which is most of your content is coming from 10 to 20%, or most of your traffic is coming from 10 to 20% of your content. And that's enough. That should be enough of an eye catcher to make you kind of rethink what you're doing. So here's how it usually goes outside of SEO. If you've ever done this, Monday, you post that brand new podcast. You got that brand new blog post. You spent months, if not weeks, churning out. Tuesday, maybe you post it out again, but probably not. Wednesday, crickets. Thursday, crickets. And then next Monday, you're back onto the next podcast, and the cycle continues and continues. And the main reason this happens is because distribution is easier said than it's done. It's very easy to tack distribution on at the end. It's very, very easy to get so focused on creating content that you just post that link and you move on to the next piece of content because, oh, now the writer's got this one in and I've got to edit that and I got to figure that out. Oh, the podcast is back and it's, complete. Now I've got to edit that. So unless we make distribution first, unless we make distribution front and center in what we're doing, it's so easy just to forget about it, put it on the back burner and never do anything about it, or cross our fingers and hope Google might someday pick up that piece of content so we can pat ourselves on the back and, not have to worry about what happened with it. The other flip side of that is that most distribution advice is not helpful at all. So this is a well-known company's resource. I did not call them out, but I went in on the hunt for this presentation and did some Googling around content distribution. And this is one of the top resources that came up for content distribution. A nice, easy checklist to be able to go through, right? Oh, you just check all these things off and distribution's taken care of, right? Well, maybe not because, for SEO, you're just going to go acquire backlinks to that content. That's easy. That's just a checkbox. Or, social media, we're just going to do Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn. Or we're just going to share it on relevant groups, of course. Like that's just a checkbox. Or repurpose content, use that content for a new content. Oh, easy. Perfect. No, this is not helpful. I actually hate these content lists. I hate these sort of like giant, massive lists of things that you're supposed to do because it's not that helpful. It's not that repeatable. And at the same time, how am I supposed to frame this up in terms of the piece of content? Is a podcast getting the same distribution as a press release? Is getting the same as this blog post? Like, how do I balance all that out? And so this is the question I asked myself. How do I go from here with one really good piece of content to here with lots of pieces of content without losing my mind? How do I do that? Is there a way that I can actually go from, constantly creating things and not doing anything with them to creating things and doing a lot with them? And the trick is you have to shift your mindset. You have to have a mindset shift. Two areas you have to shift your mindset. Think about what myths you're falling for right now. A lot of times we tell ourselves these stories in our brains of things that we think are true, or we've just done them for so long and they get stuck into what we're doing. So here's some ones that I used to fall for all the time. I have to create new content every week. If I don't create content, or if I don't have a new blog post every week, people are going to be looking. Our audience, my audience, will have, where's Justin? Where's X company? How, what are they doing? I need to be on a ton of channels. If I'm not on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, and I need to be everywhere. Or I have to do all this work myself. I can't outsource any of it. I can't, cut things up and make it easier on myself. I have to do everything and do all this work myself. The other myth I would fall for are these things that get in my way, or I would think would get in my way. So think about the blockers, the fears, the obstacles that are getting in your way from repurposing and distributing content. Is it time and budget, executive buy-in, experience, skill set? All of these things are just trip balls that we can put in our way to actually getting things done. And so here are two things I want you to be able to do and think about. You don't need to be everywhere. You don't need to be Gary Vee. You don't need to be Hormozy. You don't need to put that content everywhere. But most likely that's going to do nothing but burn you out on the other end of the burnout scale. You went from creating a bunch of content on the front end, and now you're burnout on distribution because you're trying to put it everywhere. You don't have to be everywhere. I actually advise most people start with one channel, execute on it really, really well, and then scale up from there, because all the learnings you can take from that email or the LinkedIn or the Twitter, or wherever you are, you can move those on to the next channel as well. The other thing I would say is you don't need to do everything at once. Start small, like I mentioned, and then gain momentum from there. You do not have that checklist from unnamed company. You don't have to be there. You do not have to do every single one of those checklists to be successful at distribution. I promise you, you do not have to do that. What you actually have to do is have a plan for the content that you are creating. So what distribution is, it's a little bit of a canary in the coal mine to your overall content strategy. Because what you'll learn is as you go to distribute this content, you're going to find one of two things. Either A, we're creating way too much content that we humanly can't distribute all the way unless Google picks it up. Or B, boy, when I go to distribute this content, it's not very good. And sometimes that happens too. So you really have to take a step back and think about the types of content that you're creating as well. which is where I like to say you really only need to create 3 types of content, which of course is not just 3 types of content, and we'll go through that. I use what I call the 3C content method, which is quarterly cornerstone content, monthly core content, and daily cut content. And then I like to mix and match these all the way around to be able to create an effective distribution method. So typically at the companies I've worked at or the companies I've worked with, core content is where most people spend 90% of their time in terms of a traditional content marketing team and effort. Blogs, podcasts, webinars, videos. We're going to create as many of those things in that core content bucket as humanly possible. If we get lucky, we're going to also do maybe some of these bigger cornerstone pieces of content like original research, digital events like this one, etc. Or we're going to spend maybe a little bit of time on cut content. So social posts, shorter videos, and emails. And the problem with that is you have to be able to mix all of these things, and you can mix all of these things. But when you're too heavy in any one of them, you're actually going to leave yourself kind of weak in each of those areas. And you can funnel these through in different ways. So maybe at a traditional, if within your company, you can create cornerstone content. You're going to create this event, RevCon, for instance, right? Like you're going to take this event, you can cut that up into some core content, whether it's some of the videos, you can take it and turn it into blog posts off of that, or then you can take that down and create social clips, micro videos, emails, etc., all off of that content. That's a way you can do that. And here's just what that kind of looks like, right? Like you got this original research, this cornerstone content at the top, then all the things that can come off of that: podcast episodes, webinars, etc. This is actually my favorite way that I do this as a solopreneur right now, which is cut content up into core content. So I don't necessarily have the bandwidth at this stage to create a big, nice, giant cornerstone piece of content every quarter. But what I can do is I can create this daily content, get validation on social, in email, be able to spin those things up into larger pieces of content and actually know that the content's going to hit before I spend the time, effort, and energy to create a larger piece. And you can do this at your company too. This totally works for company content as well. And just so a kind of a different idea of how that looks, right? Like you've got this LinkedIn post, which then can turn into blogs, newsletters, podcasts. And after you create each of those blogs, newsletters, and podcasts, there's more social content and cut content and email content that can come off of those as well. So let's take a look at a real life example here of how I was able to do this with some of my content. So early in the year, I had this, you see these all the time on LinkedIn. If I had to start a content strategy, here's what I do. I'd do the show, I'd repurpose it, blah, 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 blah. Well, turns out a lot of people thought that was kind of interesting to the tune of like 400 engagements, over almost 35,000 impressions. And so that was a massive signal to me that's like, oh, this piece of content that I put out, some random Tuesday on LinkedIn is pretty interesting to a lot of folks. I better create something else off of that. And so that's exactly what I did. I then took that piece of LinkedIn content and turned that into a newsletter issue for that week. I was able to expound on each one of those things. So point one, right? Create a weekly show, podcast and show. I could take that and then turn that into a section and go deep into how I would actually do that in the newsletter. From there, I could take the newsletter and use basically the format of that newsletter and turn it into a podcast episode for my podcast, Distribution First. I took each one of those points, turned it into an outline, took probably less than an hour, built out that, and now I have a podcast episode that's speaking about the same content. From there, now that I've recorded the video and recorded the podcast, I have all sorts of things that come off of that. I have YouTube videos, I have transcripts, I have snippets, I have reels. And each single one of those things are different sections, different things within that. So, a hot take on why I'm not a big fan of interview podcasts, or, how to repurpose content while maintaining consistency, how to transform your Twitter content. Like now I've got a ton of other things that I can create and spin content off of that single one idea and single LinkedIn post. So how about the results though? What actually happens? How can we measure these things as we start to put them out in the wild? Because I think this is the other key part It's great to distribute content. It's great to repurpose content. It's great to, get more bang for your buck. But how do you actually measure some of the results? How are you able to see the hard work that you're putting in to distribute this content? How can you see that out in the wild? And so I'm going to have a resource to give you at the end here where you can actually dive into the individual bits, just because we didn't have a ton of time to dive into it today. But for this particular episode, episode one of the podcast, it got 101 initial downloads. Don't necessarily think of this just as a podcast. It could be a webinar that you produce. It could be a blog post. It could be anything that you're creating. But think about that standard. If I just released this thing into the world, how many eyeballs got on this? So for that webinar, if you have, 50 to 100 people attend, same idea. And what I want to show you here is the breakdown of how distributing that content makes such a big impact. And this is like barely scratching the surface. This data is from like a few weeks worth of data. So the podcast had 101 downloads. The clips on LinkedIn had over 8,000 impressions and views. The email I sent out had 760. The carousel I put on LinkedIn had, 27,000 views, and a thread had 297. Each one of those things on their own could be interesting enough. I think what's most interesting, though, is that you go from 101 people consuming that content. And again, that's the full content, and we could debate whether, the full content versus these micro bits of content. But you go from 101 to over 36,000, And so it's just the value of getting more people in being able to see that content. And so you're getting this repurposing multiplier, this distribution of your content. I was able to get 361x the amount of views and impressions on that piece of content. And then you start to stack that every single week and start to do that every single week. And you can see where you can really scale growth and eyeballs and all of the stuff on the content you're creating. I literally just did this with a company a couple weeks ago. They had a webinar that they created, and over the past year, maybe it's gotten 50 views since it's been on the website. Because again, like, who's going watching webinars after they're done? I know I'm not. But we were able to cut up all those clips, put them out on LinkedIn, and now all that content has gathered in thousands and thousands of views and impressions over the coming months. And again, because it's a lot easier to consume a 30-second to a minute clip of a webinar than to sit down and watch 40 minutes of it. But the good thing about the distributed side is I can pick the exact moments, the exact points of view, the exact key things that I want the audience to take away, and I can put them directly in their feed where they're at. I don't have to worry about them trying to consume the full amount of content to be able to get what I want them to know. So my recommendation, if you're starting out with this, if you're a company in particular, start with your existing core content. You most likely have tons of blogs, podcast episodes, tutorials, webinars, videos. You have tons of that stuff. Start figuring out how you can get that out and distribute those pieces of content out to your audience. Go into your Google Analytics, go into your whatever analytics software you have, find your top 10 blog posts, top 10 podcast episodes, etc., and start to figure out how to get that stuff back out in front of your audience outside of maybe a Google, and be able to see how you can get that in front of them more consistently. And it's a very high level look at what that could look like. So if you take this in conjunction with that original screenshot I had of all the things you're supposed to do to get out a piece of content. And again, I'm not saying you have to do it this way, but you can fill these boxes in to make it work for your company. So podcast doesn't have to be podcast. It could be webinar. Newsletter doesn't have to be newsletter. It could be blog. Totally up to you. But if you just create this little bit of an engine every single week where you know exactly what's coming out before you create it. So when I create a podcast, I already know it's going to become a LinkedIn carousel. It's going to become a newsletter. It's going to become these 5 clips. All of those things are going to get dripped out over this amount of time period. You start to really create an engine to be able to build that stuff out and get that content out there. So like I said, I have a free resource for you. If you want to get it, go to 361.justinsimon.co. I think I linked it in there too, if I did it right, in the in the air meet. But this is essentially a detailed version of how I got that 361. So you can see examples of the content that I created, what that looks like, how those different pieces all play together, and it shows you with the real data and the breakdown there. So thank you. It looks like I did hit my time pretty well. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I'm on LinkedIn all the time. If you want to come hang out there, if you want to check out the show, it's called Distribution First. We talk about distribution and repurposing every single week with new episodes, and yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Great topic and presentation, Justin. We've got time for Q&A. We've got a question in there already. I know you guys have to have some good questions out of this, so pop those in. In the meantime, I've got plenty of things that I'd like to talk to you about on this subject because, I mean, holy crap, something near and dear to my heart. Because, I've been a growth marketer my entire career in one flavor or another. And so content for me has always been in purpose of a goal. It's trying to move the needle relative to something, related to demand gen or revenue, whatever. And so the creation of the content in and of itself was never the goal. It was, hey, what are we trying to drive or achieve out of this? And when you're coming at it from a data centric approach to it, like it's impossible to miss what your insight was, which is so much of what we're doing is not moving the needle at all. But quick aside, it's kind of funny though. I stumbled on this before I even started my B2B career because I frankly was lazy and I like to drink and party and was spent way too long in college and in academia. So took it all the way to all but dissertation for a doctorate in philosophy. So anytime I had an opportunity to reuse, like whether it was a weekly post or a term paper or I would take all of that. I rolled that into my master's thesis. I had the first 2 chapters of my dissertation already written from previous, semester's work. And so it was like, I came into this world and it was like, okay, I know how to do this. But it was really funny. I went from like being really hush hush and sort of ashamed and like, am I sort of cheating doing this to like, hey, I actually know what the hell I'm doing here.
The funny thing, Jason, is when you start to see it, you can't not see it, and you start reverse engineering everything like that.
Yep.
Like I was looking at very popular books, and authors do this all the time, right? Like they write the book and then they take the book and those pieces get broken out, and now they're doing YouTube series and podcast episodes. It's all just this big giant ecosystem of the things that they're talking about, and there's a reason behind that.
Yeah, I mean, anybody that's familiar with the ins and outs of it, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a perfect example of it. So it started off as like a radio program, then it had some television shows, then it had like, a series of different shorts that got turned into books, and like actually trying to figure out what's actually canon is actually a nightmare because like you've got bits and pieces here and there and all of it that's all been sort of pulled together as an amalgamation. And so literally some of our favorite pieces of media out there are things that were created and cobbled together that way. And I think you did a great point on that. You can come at it kind of from both angles. You can come at it from like, hey, I'm creating like this great big like pillar piece of content, a webinar being a great example of, because you got to fill an hour and you got to have enough time and resources and actual meat on the bones and typically a deck that you've created and all of that stuff, which actually winds up being something you can typically split into several different blog posts, can be the bulk of something like even as media as like an ebook or something like that. Or you can come at it from the other way, like, hey, we're going to create like a series of blog posts that are all in the subject, and then we're going to build those together and create like a pillar piece of content that maybe even something that you gate or whatever out of that. But cool. So we've got quite a few that just came through. So I'm gonna shut my mouth and take it to the audience. So from a technology standpoint, what do you like to use to take clips and repurpose them for short form content?
Yeah, my favorite by far is Descript. It's a little bit more manual. There are other ones out there to be able to take clips and repurpose them and do them like a memento or a CapCut, different things like that. But I think as far as being able to repurpose and build a template and be able to get those things and cut those out, take long piece of content, edit it. For anybody who's not familiar with video editing, it can be a little bit intimidating sometimes to go in there to a timeline. So I think Descript is really cool because you can use it like a Word doc and just cut those pieces down. It makes it really fast.
Great, great. Sean had a question. I think I can expand it out a little bit, but he's asking, what do you do if your client doesn't want to take your content that you've created and be the face of that brand? So they don't like being on video camera. They don't want to commit to a podcast webinar. Run into this all the time with people that are shy about doing a case study, not because of the case study itself. They just don't want to be the face of it. They don't want to be on the camera. They don't want to be quoted, whatever. And so I think this is a pretty common problem that you run into, and doesn't just necessarily have to be just related to a client. But what do you do whenever you're basically somebody that's gun shy on that front?
Yeah, it can be hard, especially with video. People think they need to portray themselves as a certain way. I think the easiest way is, again, if they're not comfortable doing video first. I love just recording Zoom calls. Like, it's everybody's kind of used to being on Zoom calls now, so that's like a baby step of like, we're not going to do a webinar, we're not going to do a podcast. I'm just going to sit down and ask you some questions, and maybe that's just step one. And you're not even going to share that externally. You're just going to help use that to inform content you're creating. And then you just kind of get them used to that a little bit and just say, like, hey, look, here's some of the things we could create off of this. Like, it's not so intimidating, right? Like, I'm going to help guide the conversation for you. You just have to show up and answer some questions, and we're going to make you look good. Because just so you know, post editing, you can make people look and sound pretty smart.
Yeah, I like that approach. And a lot of times what I've run into is they get overwhelmed with like this big final version that's all polished and all of this stuff that they have in their mind. And so if you can break it up into those little pieces, then a lot of times it's easier for them to be able to bite that off and not get so overwhelmed with it. So Meg has one tactical question, and I think this is a great one, that goes to that data-driven aspect of it. But how do you organize and keep your content calendar updated based off of these feedback loops that you're getting from the data and the sharing of and creation of net new content?
Yeah, a huge part of that, and we didn't even really get into the core of like distribution first, but the idea with a lot of the distribution first methodology and framework that I work with companies is to even understand what your distribution channels are up front, to know how much content you even have to reverse engineer to get out. So for instance, if you're only using LinkedIn as your channel and maybe email, and you're sending 5 posts a week and 1 email a week, you don't need very much content to reverse engineer back into that. Compare that to somebody else who's maybe like, we're doing pure SEO. We got to grow our blog. You might need a lot more content, but that's your main distribution channel. And so like understanding how and what and where you're distributing that content is a good way to kind of adjust and see what's working. And I also, again, like if you think about the Cornerstone core and cut content, like cut is that daily, like that we're really shifting worlds here in terms of how people are consuming content, to where you have to be front and center every single day. It's almost more important to be daily at this point than to say, I have got this calendar that's got my blog cadence on it. It's much more important, and at least in my mind, to have like that sort of daily engine going, weekly engine going, and then reverse engineering up to Cornerstone and core content to understand what I even have to create. That then builds the content calendar.
Yep. That's exactly the approach I found that works. Well, Justin, we are out of time. This has been awesome. If you couldn't tell, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And frankly, I can't believe we've not connected before now. And I'm going to be following up with you because I think we got quite a bit more to that we should talk through.
Absolutely. Super fun, Jason. Would love to connect in and chat more. And thanks everybody for listening. If you have any questions, obviously reach out and be more than happy to connect.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.